Major Robert Anderson, a Northern soldier and a good, godly Christian gentleman, was the man who, you might say, set off the spark that launched us into the Civil War. Born in Kentucky and raised in Virginia, he understood both the North and Southern problems. He was a graduate of West Point and friends with soon-to-be Southern General Robert E. Lee. The Northern Army decided that he would be the perfect commander for the Northern's southern forts that guarded the southern Atlantic seacoast. So he was put in charge of 3 forts, Montier, Johnson, and Sumter. Looking over the 3 forts and fearing a southern attack, he decided to move his 70 to 100 soldiers to an island where Fort Sumter was located. Fort Sumter was a practically completed red-brick federal military fortification built on a tiny island off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. It was located at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, and along with Fort Montier nearby, it guarded this key port on the Atlantic coast. Both forts were under the command of Robert Anderson, who was then stationed at Fort Montier. When South Carolina succeeded the Union on December 20th, 1860, Major Robert Anderson was convinced he would be attacked from the west by the Confederacy's Carolina militia. Because Fort Montier's crumbling and weak defenses invited an attack, one night Robert Anderson secretly transferred his entire force of men into Fort Sumter, which he considered a more defensible post. When Governor Francis Picking of South Carolina heard of this move, he demanded that Robert Anderson return to Fort Montier. But the major flatly refused. At once, Southern Confederate forces took possession of the Fort Montier, along with the federal arsenal of Charleston, and in so doing, they set in motion the war between the states. Meanwhile, Anderson hurried to complete the fort's defenses. Sumter was a 5-sided fort with walls between 5 and 10 feet thick. Its guns, which were fired through holes called embrasures in the fort, were too few in number and unfortunately out of position. There was plenty of shot, shell, and powder, but friction primers, which were used to set off the ammunition, were in short supply, as was the food in the fort. On January 9, 1861, a futile attempt was made to reinforce and supply Sumter by means of an unarmed steamer from the north called the Star of the West. Confederate shore batteries opened fire on her, the first shots of the Civil War. On April 11, 1861, after a siege of nearly 4 months, Major Robert Anderson refused a formal offer by the South to accept his surrender. At dawn the next morning, the Stars and Stripes were still flying on the flagpole as the bombing began. It was a steady bombardment, but by the next afternoon, the fort's barracks were set afire and flames threatened to explode the ammunition supply. Major Anderson, realizing that his position was now hopeless, was forced to surrender on April 14th. The next day, he and his tiny garrison marched out of the fort, embarked for the north on a United States Navy ship which had stood offshore. Miraculously, only one man had been killed. It was on Robert Anderson's side, while loading a cannon which exploded, blowing off his arm. Later, the loss of blood and shock killed the poor soldier. I'd like to make a Bible application here. Major Anderson was given an opportunity to surrender the fort and to pull out with his troops and head north without a shot being fired. But he chose to stay and fight for what his country felt was right, a United States, not divided. I recall during the 1970s a song that said, "United we stand, divided we fall. And if our backs should ever be against the wall, we'll be together, you and I." Robert Anderson was willing to die for the unity of a nation. Remember what I said in the first devotion, quoting Mark 3:25? A house divided against itself cannot stand. Today we are once again in a great struggle within our very nation. A large number of citizens and government officials that are ungodly want to take and misuse our liberty. For example, to abort the unborn baby, to close Christian schools, to rid themselves of God, prayer, and His holy book, the Bible, in public places. There are godly laws that are still on the books today, but are not followed. A confederate, rebellious group of wicked, sin-sick people exists in our nation today, flaunting homosexuality, pornography, child abuse, divorce, and remarriage. Living fast, spending big bucks on fake credit. Like Robert Anderson, you and I need to put our foot down and not surrender our nation to a confederacy, a group of people that are assembled for unlawful purposes. Rise and be counted. King David said, "Fight hard for our cities and for the cities of our God." Let me tell you how that works. Not long ago, while I was in Coos Bay, Oregon, I went into a Pioneer car stereo shop. I had to order some knobs that were stolen from my van. I went in there, placed the order. They didn't have knobs in stock. And I looked over on the counter. On to the right side of the counter was a naked girl from the waist up. Along by her belly button, it said Pioneer. I was grieved in my spirit and offended. I placed the order and started to walk out. But the Lord said, "Richard, you go back in there and tell that man that you don't like what you see." Well, I argued. I said, "Lord, I can't do that. I'm a young man. He'll think I'm weird." He said, "Well, if you don't, who's going to?" So I said, "Well, my wife's out there. I can go ask her to do it." And he says, "No, I want you to do it." So I walked back to this man, and I asked him if he was the owner. He said he was the manager. And then I pointed to the billboard without even looking, and I said, "That offends me, mister." I go, "What if I came in here with a 12-year-old boy, and he's right at the counter looking at that? Why does he have to be exposed to that pornography in a store that has nothing to do with pornography? This is a car stereo shop." The man stood there in silence, shocked, and he said, "I never thought of that." Well, I said, "I just felt I had to get it off my chest." I walked out and found the knobs in another store. I came back out of courtesy to cancel the order, and I looked back on the counter, and do you know what? It was gone. Stand for what's right. This nation needs you and your voice. Don't surrender its liberties.